Seville, 1252. A king is laid to rest in a great religious center. It is not the city of his birth, but one he has made his own. He will be remembered as a great conqueror who built one of the new powers of Europe from almost nothing and championed the power of his religion. But his land is also one of tremendous multiculturalism and religious tolerance, and his tomb is inscribed in 4 languages: Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and a newly codified local language that will come to be known as Spanish. Seville may be in Andalusia, but this is not Al-Andalus. This is a Christian king in a Christian kingdom, Fernando III of Castile. The 4 languages inscribed on his tomb are a testament to this land as he knew it, the greatest center of European learning for people of all faiths and nations. Over the next century and a half, that land will disappear. By the time of Fernando's death, 100 years had passed since the Jews of Al-Andalus had been driven north by the Almohad invasions. This was not the culture clash one might imagine. Castile's capital, Toledo, had been a Muslim state not much earlier. And in addition to Jews and Castilians, the city was also home to Arabized Christians, or Mozarabs, as well as Latinized Muslims who had been living in the north for generations. If anything, it was the Jews of the northern kingdoms who were viewed with suspicion and snobbery by the refugees from the south, whose wealth and fame led to the rise of the most powerful Jewish family in Western Europe. Around the time of the Almohad invasions, a Jewish refugee named Todros Abulafia was appointed as Toledo's chief rabbi, presiding over the city's court as well as its up-and-coming yeshiva. Later on, his son Meir took over the position at only 30 years old, though he found himself pretty isolated as the only anti-Maimonidean at court. And when Ferdinand III died in 1252, his son Alfonso X appointed Todros' grandson, also named Todros, as Castile's very first Nagid. By this time, the Almohads had finally been driven out of Spain, beginning the 3rd and final Taifas period. The Jews could have gone back south, and a few thousand did, but there wasn't much point to it anymore. Alfonso actively encouraged Jewish participation in the arts and sciences, and promoted Spanish as a common national language for all ethnic and religious groups. Castile had all the legacy, money, and prestige, and it was about to experience a revolution in Judaism. In 1280, a rabbi in the city of Avila named Mosè de Leon announced that he had discovered a previously lost work of the 2nd century anti-Roman firebrand Shimon Bar Yochai, the Zohar, a commentary on the Torah which also served as a comprehensive guide to the increasingly popular art of Jewish mysticism known as the Reception, or Kabbalah. Now, I'm not technically allowed to learn Kabbalah, so this explanation is going to be super basic and will probably still get some things wrong. Just bear with me. Kabbalah is not the Hollywood fad associated with Madonna. Rather, that is a New Age corruption of Kabbalistic imagery popularized in the 20th century by the controversial rabbi Philip Berg. The images most popularly associated with Kabbalah, the red string and evil eye, are actually just regular accessories of the Sephardic minhag and have nothing to do with Kabbalah. If they did, their very use would be forbidden, for reasons that I'll explain shortly. In Rabbinic Judaism, there are 4 traditional methods of interpreting each verse of the Torah: Peshat, the surface interpretation; Remez, the allegorical interpretation; Derash, the comparative interpretation; and Sod, the secret interpretation. Kabbalah is all about the Sod. During the Hellenistic period, Jews adopted the Greek method of using letters to represent numbers as well as sounds. An accidental side effect of this was that Hebrew words could also be read as numerical sequences, and by the 1st century CE, members of the Great Sanhedrin came to believe that doing this, a practice known as gematria, would reveal secret meanings in the Torah. Sometime later, probably in the 2nd century, a book of unknown authorship called the Sefer Yetzirah purported that each number could serve as a pathway between the 10 Sfirot, methods of understanding through which humanity can experience the Ein Sof, the form taken by God before he created the universe. But there were some problems with De Leon's claims that the Zohar was a lost work of Shimon Bar Yochai. For one, the Mishnah makes extensive references to other rabbinical publications of its era, including many that have since been lost, and the Zohar isn't one of them. Shimon Bar Yochai wasn't exactly known for being soft-spoken, so why would he have kept this secret? And why would it only appear 1100 years later in Spain? Before going any further, let me be clear. It would be wrong to say that De Leon crafted the Zohar from scratch. Jewish mysticism had always existed in some form. Even the Mishnah repeatedly references two different mystical doctrines, Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava. Tracts on Kabbalah had begun to pop up in France around the time of Maimonides, and in fact gained popularity among anti-Maimonideans in opposition to his rationalist approach. In an effort to reconcile the two schools of thought, Nachmanides had associated certain aspects of Kabbalah with Maimonidean Neoplatonism in his commentary on the Torah, and in the wake of his departure for Jerusalem, there was a huge market for a comprehensive guide to the subject. So the Zohar essentially did for Jewish mysticism what the Mishneh Torah did for Jewish law. But it would also be wrong to say that De Leon was being truthful about the Zohar's origins. A former student of Nachmanides named Yitzchak of Acre reported that none of his colleagues in Palestine had ever heard of the Zohar before, and thus came to Castile in 1305 to investigate. Upon meeting Yitzchak, De Leon swore that he possessed an original copy of the Zohar written by Shimon Bar Yochai and that it was at his home in Avila. However, De Leon died on his way home just a few days later. Undeterred, Yitzchak visited Avila, where it was apparently common knowledge that De Leon had written the Zohar himself and attributed it to Bar Yochai in order to sell more copies. Apparently, De Leon's wife and daughter had spoken freely about this to the other Jewish women of the city, who in turn told their husbands, and now everybody knew. He hadn't even really tried to hide it. The Aramaic is shaky and very obviously translated directly from Spanish. In one passage, he even used the Portuguese word for synagogue. And the text makes repeated references to the Crusades and Hebrew vowel diacritics, which were only invented in the 10th century. But because the Zohar was so popular, and the revelations so controversial, republications of Yitzchak's investigation were heavily censored to hide his conclusions all the way until 1857. Though today, De Leon is accepted as the author by most schools of Judaism. In any case, even before the Zohar's publication, many of the ideas encompassed within it had already spawned three distinct methods of Kabbalah. Theosophical Kabbalah, the use of human symbols and concepts to conceptualize the divine realm. Practical Kabbalah, the use of symbols and numerology to create icons and talismans to influence the living world. Basically magic, and it's all but forbidden to engage in this practice so long as the Jewish temple isn't rebuilt. This is one of the many reasons that Kabbalah is only taught to Jewish men over the age of 40. And if you're out there going, but I'm not a Jewish man over 40 and I'm learning Kabbalah, no you're not, you're being swindled. And finally, ecstatic Kabbalah, the use of symbols, numerology, and meditation to attempt a direct experiential connection with the Ein Sof. Then, as today, ecstatic Kabbalah was the most prominent method, for better or for worse. In 1271, a rabbi named Abraham Abulafia began experiencing visions inspiring him to dedicate his life to ecstatic Kabbalah, moving to the Kingdom of Sicily and teaching yeshiva students that accessing the Ein Sof would enable modern man to reacquire the power of biblical prophecy. In 1280, Abulafia marched on the Palazzo Suriano after receiving a vision that Pope Nicholas III would come to him to convert to Judaism. Nicholas, upon hearing this, ordered Abulafia to be killed on the spot, but died just hours before Abulafia arrived. This was starting to be a problem. After the papal incident, Abulafia moved to Messina, proclaimed himself the Messiah, and earned himself a cherem from Salomon ben Aderet, the chief rabbi of Barcelona who'd replaced Nachmanides. Abulafia's books were banned, and he died in exile on the island of Comino. That it fell to Rabbi ben Aderet to speak out against Abulafia signified more than an opposition to messianic delusions. Abulafia was not just a Kabbalist, but an outspoken and lifelong Maimonidean. And despite Nachmanides' best intentions, Ben Aderet was among the last prominent anti-Maimonideans. In fact, he lived to see their end. In 1306, tens of thousands of expelled Jews from France and England flooded into the Iberian Peninsula. Southern France had been the epicenter of the anti-Maimonideans, and the Jewish community there had been spared the earlier expulsion of 1254 for complicated feudal reasons. What had been a shrinking but respectably sized minority in France was now a tiny, powerless fringe movement of foreign refugees in Spain, of which no more was heard again. 102 years after his death, Maimonides had won Judaism. By this time, all of the Muslim taifas in the south had been annexed by Castile and Aragon as their ruling dynasties had gradually died out. Except for Granada, which just happened to also be the first European country to adopt canons. And this was pretty much the end of the good times on the peninsula. As more and more Jewish refugees fled into Spain from the rest of Europe, where Jewish opportunities for employment had been restricted, an ever larger proportion of the community were moneylenders. And by the end of the 13th century, the same thing was happening in Spain that had already happened in France and England. Italian banking families that had made their fortune financing the latter crusades started spreading through Europe, which meant that Jewish moneylenders were no longer indispensable. But wait, I hear you say, why were the Italian banking families even a thing if Roman Catholics weren't allowed to charge interest? And you're right, they couldn't charge interest. But they could compel debtors under threat of violence to intentionally fall behind on their payments in order to charge massive late fees. So much more respectable than a fixed interest rate. Unlike in England and France, Spain's Jewish population was sufficiently large, and certain Jewish families were sufficiently well connected that expulsion wasn't a realistic possibility. But those same factors also made them an easy target in any popular uprising, such as in 1328, when a mendicant friar in Navarre led the peasantry in a massacre of 5,000 Jews. But the real turning point came, as did so many turning points, with the arrival of the Black Death. The Black Death probably wasn't as devastating in the peninsula as it had been in the rest of Europe, the broad acceptance and dissemination of Jewish and Muslim norms regarding personal hygiene being a major factor. But make no mistake, it was nevertheless widespread and deadly, and in Castile it took one very important victim. On the 26th of March 1350, King Alfonso the Avenger of Castile succumbed to the plague, and the crown fell to his 16-year-old son Pedro. In the midst of this, thousands of Jews fleeing the plague massacres in the Holy Roman Empire arrived in Castile. In fact, by this time, Iberia was home to almost a quarter of the world's Jewish population. As the plague had caused a massive shortage of skilled labor, Pedro and his chief minister, Lord Albuquerque, welcomed the Jews with open arms. But Pedro's illegitimate half-brother, Enrique de Trastamara, did not. And by finding an enemy in the Jews, Enrique was able to rally popular support and transform his enmity for Pedro into a full-fledged civil war. Enrique's claim was further fueled when Pedro and Albuquerque appointed the Jewish Samuel Abulafia as treasurer. Enrique allied himself with France and Aragon, invaded Castile, and sacked the homes of Toledo's Jews, killing 1,200. With Abulafia's help, Pedro was able to help drive Henry back out of Castile, but the war raged on, and cast a shadow over Pedro's acceptance of Jews. In 1357, Abulafia built the Synagogue of El Tránsito, perhaps the grandest of all synagogues in Spain's history. Built in a Granadine style, with carved inscriptions in Hebrew and Arabic, the building was condemned by the local Catholic Church. Abulafia was indispensable to Pedro. He had just presided over the signing of a peace treaty with Portugal. But fearing that the church would side with Enrique over this, Pedro turned against Abulafia, who was charged with embezzlement and tortured to death along with his family. Meanwhile, in exile, Enrique was able to renew his alliances and invade Castile once more. By this time, the 100 Years' War was raging on in France, and Pedro responded to Enrique's French-backed aggression by forging an alliance with England. But it was to no avail. In 1366, Enrique overran the kingdom and personally killed his brother, whom he posthumously dubbed Pedro the Cruel. In the course of the war, 38,000 Jews were killed, both soldiers and civilians. And at the war's end, Enrique imprisoned all of Toledo's Jews until they could raise a war debt of 20,000 gold doubloons. Ironically, once on the throne, Enrique became intensely reliant on a Jewish advisor, Don José Pichon, to collect the kingdom's taxes and recoup the losses from the Civil War. In response, Catholic bishops launched a mass protest, demanding a series of new draconian laws to repeal the freedoms Jews had enjoyed in Iberia for 600 years. Initially, Enrique only accepted two of their demands: that Jews be required to wear the infamous badge, and that they be forbidden from having Catholic names, whatever that means. But over time, more prohibitions were issued. Among the king's final decrees in 1379 was that Jews should not be allowed to hold public office, a parting insult against Pichon, who after Enrique's death was arrested and executed for treason, an act that was itself used by Enrique's son Juan I as justification to forbid Jews from practicing criminal law. By the time of his premature death in 1390, Juan had confined Jews to ghettos and outlawed any association between them and Christians, though he did make personal exceptions for those associated with him. Juan's death provoked anarchy in the court. His 11-year-old son was too young to rule, and his regents found themselves unable to assert control over the cities. In December, the Archdeacon Ferran Martinez, who'd previously been prosecuted for his invocations against the Jews, led an angry mob to massacre the Jews of Alcalá de Guadarrama. In March, he moved against the Jews of Seville, threatening to kill the mayor's family if he dared stop them. There, on the 6th of June, 4,000 Jews were killed, and the rest were baptized by force. Over the next several days, massacres spread to Écija, Cazalla, Fregenal de la Sierra, and the once great city of Córdoba, where the entire Jewish quarter was burned down and all 2,000 of its Jews were murdered. By the end of June, the violence had spread to Jaén and then to the capital Toledo, among whose dead could be counted several descendants of Natan ben Eliezer, the rabbi who had chronicled the Rhineland massacres 3 centuries earlier. Over the summer, it spread into the crownlands of Aragon, engulfing Valencia, Palma, Barcelona, and Lérida. By the end of the year, at least 10,000 Jews had been killed, several thousand had fled to North Africa, and tens of thousands had been forced to convert. The foremost Jewish leaders of Castile had been eradicated, and the Jewish community of Catalonia had effectively been erased from existence. This was Spain in 1391, and it was only the beginning. Special thanks to my patrons, including Jeremy Biskind, Ted Rossini, Corey Ard, Eric Atreides, Matthew Brotman, Lev Ham, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, Vicky Nelson, Navet Tal, Useful Charts, and Or Weiss.